Hello, we're back again to discuss the various end times frameworks through which all of eschatology may be viewed. Um, the great frameworks are covenantalism and dispensationalism, but there are others that are competing for the time. We already talked about one, which was preterism, and today we want to talk about another, which is Adventism. There are several groups of Adventist churches around. Some are more true to their name than others. But we want to talk about Adventism not as a religious body, but Adventism as a hermeneutical structure. So let's dive into that now. We'll look at their history a little bit and what their main driving hermeneutic is. Adventism is somewhat similar to preterism. And it teaches that the return of Christ happened invisibly, usually in the year 1844. Although there are a heretical sect of Adventists, the Jehovah's Witnesses, who believe that the return of Christ happened in 1914. Excuse me, we'll set this up just in a minute to explain this. No, I don't think Adventists are heretical. I think they have an eschatological hermeneutic that is faulty, and I don't think that it always holds up. And that's the thing about Adventism as an eschatological framework. But I do believe Jehovah's Witnesses are heretical. I believe that they are a cult, and I believe that their Adventism is not that big a deal. The real reason they're a cult is that they deny Jesus Christ. Adventists do not. But Adventists do have some interesting views of the end times, and it again comes back, just like preterism does, to hermeneutics, because they have a controlling hermeneutic that may not always be correct. But let's dive into it. Before 1844, the magic date for Adventism, Adventism was known as Millerism, after its founder, William Miller. Miller was a native of upstate New York, a converted deist, which means at one time in his life he believed that God was aloof and apart and was the great watchmaker of the world. He believed, and he became convinced of this, I think sometime in the 1820s, that the date of the return of Christ could be determined from Scripture. That encoded within the Bible is the ability to find out when Jesus will return. Now, never mind that Jesus said, "No man knows the day or the hour." Never mind that he said that. Miller was convinced that he could figure it out. And his main hermeneutical principle was what is known as the day-year principle. The belief that when the word day is used in apocalyptic passages, it means a year. So if something happened 2,300 days, that was 2,300 years. The day-year principle within apocalyptic literature was Miller's driving hermeneutic. Now let's look and see how he used it. He began with Daniel 8:14, which says that 2,300 days would pass until the sanctuary was cleansed. Okay, you can look that up in Daniel 8:14. Using his hermeneutical principle, he reasoned that there were 2,300 years left in the world's clock from the time the clock started to tick. Okay, you got that? That's the driving interpretation of Adventism as an eschatological framework. 2,300 days equals 2,300 years that are left on the world's clock once the clock starts ticking. Okay, he calculated the date for the ticking to begin in 457 BC, the date of King Artaxerxes' decree to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem under the direction of Nehemiah. So in 457 BC, the clock begins to tick, and the countdown begins. 2,300 years to pass, which brings him in 1844. Because if you subtract 457 from 2,300, you get 1843, and recall there's no year zero, so you have to add one, so that gets you to 1844. And that was the hermeneutical structure that Miller used to determine that all would come to pass in 1844. Jesus would return, and the world would be made right. And he began to preach this through the 1830s and began to accumulate a bit of a following. And that following multiplied as the date drew near. When 1844 came and went with no visible return of Christ, and it was known in Millerite circles as the Great Disappointment. Really, they had congregated together on a hill in New York. Jesus is going to return to New York, but they had congregated on a hill in New York, all dressed in white robes in October. Now it's cold in New York in October, so they're out there on this hillside, freezing, waiting for Jesus to return on a certain day. I think it was October 22nd, and October 22nd came and went. They even hung around an extra day or two. Still no Jesus. Yields the Great Disappointment. Miller became convinced of his error, recanted his teachings, and disappears. We don't hear from him again. But some of his followers, however, remained convinced that he was correct and began to assert that Jesus did return, albeit invisibly. Now see, this is a case of where we take our hermeneutic and force it to fit. Just like the preterists do. They choose 70, and by golly, it's 70 or bust. And Adventism, as an eschatological framework, takes that same bulldog mentality and says it's 1844 or bust. And then others change the date, but using different calculations, but they still have the same hermeneutical principle involved. The Adventist churches then grow out of Miller's followers, and the main person that is the spokesperson as they grow is Ellen White. But that's really, Adventist churches are not my point of my critique here. It's Adventism as an eschatological framework. Let's take a look at Miller's methodology. Can we critique it? And I believe we can. Is the day-year principle legitimate in all cases? Well, there's also the idea of Daniel 9. Daniel 9, in developing this principle, then there's also the idea of 7 times punishment, and then the 6th-day creation, and the 7th day of millennial rest. I don't know that we have hermeneutical warrant for always saying that day equals year. I just don't know that we have that. Daniel 9 makes the leap in Scripture from 70 years to 77s of years. Now that's already interpreted for us, and we don't have to deal with that. So that leap is made, but I don't know that we always have the warrant to make the leap from day to year. Maybe Daniel's talking about 2,300 legitimate days. I don't know. But I'm certainly not willing to build an entire eschatological framework on that weak of a foundation, because we don't know that always a day equals a year. It could, but doesn't have to. And there's no solid biblical foundation for that to occur. So my judgment on Miller is that Miller was wrong. He knew he was wrong once he had been proven wrong, recanted, and scrapped Adventism as an eschatological framework. And I think he was wise in doing so, because that day-year principle is the engine that drives the train. And it's a principle that I don't think is capable of bearing the weight that's required to have a workable hermeneutical structure. Now, that's not speaking badly against Adventist churches. I'm not talking about Adventist churches. I'm talking about Adventism as an eschatological structure or an eschatological framework. I think that it is dubious at best because so much weight is placed on that day-year principle. And to be quite honest with you, I've seen other dates for Artaxerxes' decree to Nehemiah, and if that and it depends that date 457 is right. I've seen it as late as 445. So if that's off, if Miller's original calculation of Artaxerxes' decree is off, 1844 is off. So much depends on things that are so sketchy historically. The reigns of kings in the BC era is notoriously hard to nail down because they weren't always precise with their dates and their times. Not the Bible, but secular history. They didn't care. It was in the 30th year of his reign. Well, is that 30 years or 29 years? Well, you multiply that out over 10 or 15 kings, you can get a 10 or 15 year discrepancy. And they weren't always careful with those things. They didn't date everything as we do today. So it's unwise for us to try to write back into their world our views of precision. And that 457 date may not be true either. So, that being said, Adventism is a difficult to grasp eschatological structure because it's based on so many things with so little evidence. Now we want to move on to the other three millennial views: postmillennialism, amillennialism, and premillennialism. They're coming up next. Thanks. Bye.